They didn't know who was sitting across the aisle from them. They walked into that courtroom with their attorney, shoulders straight, eyes cold, carrying 22 years of silence like it was armor. They didn't look at me once. Not when they settled into their seats. Not when the bailiff called the room to order. Not even when their own lawyer stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said, "Good morning, Dr. Voss." He meant me. I watched my mother's face go white. I was 17 when they told me to leave. Not asked. Told. My mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom, the bedroom I'd slept in since I was 4 years old. With the yellow curtains she'd hung herself, and she said the words in a voice so flat it didn't even sound like her. "You have until Friday." It was a Tuesday. I told them 2 weeks earlier. I was pregnant, barely showing, barely able to process it myself, and I'd sat them down at the kitchen table the way they always sat me down when something serious needed to be said. I thought they'd be angry. I thought there'd be yelling, maybe crying, maybe a long silence before someone said something about figuring it out together. There was no together. Not for them. My father didn't say a word. He just stood up and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the garage door open and his car pull out of the driveway, and I didn't see him again until 3 days later when he came home like nothing had happened. My mother sat at the table for a long time after he left, and I actually believed that her staying meant something, that she was choosing me. She wasn't choosing me. She was just waiting to figure out what to do next. Friday came. I had 2 suitcases and a trash bag of books and a checking account with $240. My mother handed me a folded piece of paper on my way out the door. It was a list of shelters in the county. She printed it from the internet. She didn't hug me. She didn't say she was sorry. She said, "I hope you find your way." I stood on the front porch with my bags and I watched the door close, and I thought, very clearly, with the kind of clarity that only comes from real shock, I will never be nothing again. I didn't know if I believed it yet, but I held on to it anyway because it was all I had. I called my grandmother from a gas station payphone 2 miles from the house. My cell had been on my parents' plan, and my mother had canceled it the night before. I had the number memorized because she'd made me memorize it when I was 7 years old. "In case you ever need me," she'd said. "In case you can't find anyone else." She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Gran, I'm in trouble." She said, "Where are you?" That was it. No judgment, no intake of breath, no pause before deciding. Just, "Where are you?" As if the only thing that mattered was getting to me as fast as possible. She drove 40 minutes in the rain to pick me up. She was 68 years old, and she drove a 20-year-old station wagon that rattled on the highway. And she pulled into that gas station lot and got out and hugged me before I could even say another word. She smelled like lavender soap and coffee, and I cried into her shoulder for probably 5 minutes straight while the gas station attendant pretended not to watch. She took me home. Her house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that was always warm because she baked bread every Sunday. She'd lived alone since my grandfather died. She turned the second bedroom, which she'd been using for her sewing, back into a proper room. She made up the bed with fresh sheets. She didn't ask me questions that night. She just fed me soup and sat across the table from me and said, "You're going to be all right." I didn't believe her either, but I was starting to. My son was born in March. I was still 17. Gran was in the delivery room with me because she was the only one I wanted there, and she held my hand for 11 hours and didn't let go even once. When they put him in my arms for the first time, she leaned over and looked at his small, blinking face, and she whispered, "Oh, he's going to be something." I named him after my grandfather. It felt right, like a thread connecting backwards and forwards at the same time. The first year was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I say that as someone who later spent 7 years in medical training. Nothing in medical school broke me the way that first year did. The exhaustion was physical, but it was also something deeper, a kind of grief I didn't have a name for yet. Grief for the version of my life I'd expected. Grief for parents who'd chosen to disappear rather than stay. grief for 17-year-old me, who'd done nothing wrong except trust that family meant unconditional. Gran helped with the baby every morning so I could finish high school. She drove me to prenatal appointments, then pediatric appointments, then parent-teacher conferences years later. She never made me feel like a burden. Not once. Not even when money was tight, which it often was, and not even when my son went through a phase at age 3 where he woke up screaming at 2 in the morning every single night for 6 weeks straight. She was the one who first said I should think about medicine. I'd been working part-time at a clinic after high school, doing administrative work, and one evening Gran was sitting at the kitchen table going over the bills while I told her about a patient case I'd overheard the doctors discussing. I was animated about it. Probably more animated than I'd been about anything in months. I didn't notice until I stopped talking and found her watching me with this expression I didn't entirely understand. "You know what you sound like right now?" she said. I shook my head. "Like someone who belongs in that room," she said. "Not outside it." I applied to community college that fall. It took me 3 years to get my prerequisites done while working and raising my son, but I did it. I applied to medical school at 26, an age some of my classmates' parents were treating as late, and I didn't care. I'd stopped keeping other people's timelines by then. Medical school was brutal and beautiful and lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd sent my son to Gran's for weeks at a time during the worst rotations, and she'd send me photos of the two of them baking or doing puzzles. And those photos kept me going through nights when I genuinely didn't think I was going to make it. She died in my 3rd year of residency. She was 79. She went quietly in her sleep, in the house where she'd taken me in all those years before. My son called me at 5 in the morning, and I drove 4 hours through the dark, and I sat beside her bed even though she was already gone, because I didn't know what else to do. I just sat there and held her hand and talked to her, which I know sounds strange, but it felt necessary. At the funeral, a neighbor told me she'd talked about me and my son every single day. Every single day. Every single day. "She was so proud," the neighbor said. "She said you were going to do something that mattered." I didn't have it in me to cry anymore by then. I just nodded and said, "I hope so." The will was straightforward. Gran had been careful with money her whole life, lived simply, invested quietly. She left me the house and everything in it, including a savings account I hadn't known existed. The total, when the estate lawyer laid it out for me, was just over $900,000. I sat in that lawyer's office and I didn't say anything for a long moment. I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about my mother handing me a printed list of shelters. I was thinking about the door closing. I thanked the lawyer, signed the paperwork, and drove home. I didn't tell anyone. Not my colleagues, not my friends, not the few people from my old life I'd stayed loosely in touch with. I had no reason to think my parents even knew Gran had died. We had not spoken in 22 years. Not a letter, not a phone call, nothing. I didn't even know if they still lived in the same house. I'd chosen not to know. 18 months after Gran died, I got a call from an attorney. I was in the hospital when the call came through. I was an attending physician by then, running on 3 hours of sleep after a long overnight, and my assistant flagged it as something I needed to return. The attorney's name meant nothing to me. The firm name meant nothing to me. When I called back, the attorney explained, in very measured language, that he represented my parents, who were contesting the terms of my grandmother's estate. They were alleging that Gran had not been of sound mind when she wrote her final will. They were alleging that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly woman. They were seeking a significant portion of the estate. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and let him finish. Then I said, "I'll have my attorney contact you." I sat there for a few more minutes after I hung up. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the yellow curtains. I thought about the printed list of shelters. I thought about Gran's face in the delivery room, the way she'd said, "Oh, he's going to be something." And then I thought about what my legal options were, because I am, if nothing else, a practical person. I need to explain something that my parents didn't know, and that their attorney apparently hadn't bothered to research before filing. 3 years earlier, I had been appointed to the hospital ethics board of my state's largest medical center, which is a formal position that involves periodic coordination with state medical licensing bodies and, in certain complex cases, the courts. That work had brought me into regular contact with the legal system at a level most physicians never reach. And through that work, I had also been appointed, quietly, without fanfare, because that's how these things happen, as a medical expert consultant to the state's probate court, a position that gave me formal standing in exactly the kind of estate proceedings my parents were now initiating. In short, I wasn't just the defendant in this case, I was someone the court already knew. The judge assigned to the case knew my name from 3 separate prior consultations. When my parents' attorney filed the initial paperwork and the case was docketed, there is a process by which all parties are notified of the presiding authority. My parents' attorney either didn't read it carefully or didn't know who I was. The first hearing was a preliminary matter, procedural, brief, nothing substantive. I attended without saying much. I sat at the respondent's table in my regular clothes, not my white coat, because this had nothing to do with medicine. It had to do with a woman who'd baked bread every Sunday and kept the second bedroom clear just in case. My parents came in with their attorney. They looked older, which shouldn't have surprised me and somehow still did. My mother's hair had gone fully silver. My father walked with a slight stiffness in his right leg. I didn't remember. They took their seats without looking at the respondent's table. I don't think they'd registered that I was there at all. Their attorney, a man I'd never met, in a good suit, carrying a leather portfolio, stood to address the court. The judge looked up from the bench. He was a man I'd worked with twice in the past 4 years. He'd always been courteous, precise, and thorough. He said, "Good morning, Doctor Voss." He meant me. I watched my mother turn her head slowly toward the respondent's table for the first time. The expression on her face was, I don't have the right word for it. It wasn't quite recognition. It was something closer to the ground shifting beneath her. Their attorney stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the judge, then at me, then back at the judge. I saw him understand in real time that his client had sued someone the court already knew and respected, in a case with no legitimate evidentiary foundation, based on an allegation of undue influence against a woman who'd had 2 attorneys review her final wishes before signing. He cleared his throat. The case didn't end that day. These things don't end in one hearing. But it was the beginning of the end, and everyone in that courtroom understood it. The case was dismissed 4 months later. The medical and legal review of Gran's mental state at the time of the will was unambiguous. She'd been sharp and deliberate and fully autonomous until her final weeks, and there was ample documentation to prove it. My parents' attorney withdrew the contested claims before it ever reached a full hearing. There was no dramatic verdict, no gavel-bang moment, just a legal filing that said, in essentially bureaucratic language, there is no case here. My attorney told me afterward that my parents had spent a significant amount of their own money on legal fees for something that was never going to succeed. I didn't feel satisfied by that. I want to be honest about that. I thought I would, and I didn't. What I felt was tired in a way that had nothing to do with medicine or sleepless nights in the hospital. Tired in the way you feel when something you've been carrying for a very long time finally gets set down and your arms don't quite know what to do without the weight. 2 weeks after the dismissal, I got a call from my mother. I almost didn't pick up. My phone showed a number I didn't recognize. They'd have a different number now, of course, but something made me answer. She said my name. Just my name, the way she used to when I was small, before everything. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't a reconciliation. I want to be clear about that too. It wasn't forgiveness sealed with a handshake. It wasn't tears and apologies that erased 22 years. My mother said she was sorry. She said it more than once, in different ways, as if she was trying to find the version that fit. My father got on the phone for a few minutes and said less, but said it. There was something genuine in his voice that I hadn't expected and didn't know how to hold. I told them about my son. I told them his grandfather's name. I told them he was 22 years old now, that he'd just started graduate school, that Gran had loved him fiercely for every year of his life, and that he'd loved her back the same way. I didn't tell them they could be part of our lives. I didn't tell them they couldn't be either. I said I needed time. I said I didn't know yet what came next. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet. My son was in another city, living his own life, the life Gran had always said he'd have. I thought about what she'd told me the night she picked me up at the gas station, when I was 17 and soaking wet and certain the world had ended. "You're going to be all right." She'd been so sure. I got up, put on my jacket, and drove to the cemetery where she was buried. It was early evening, and the light was low and golden through the trees, the kind of light that makes everything look soft. I sat beside her headstone and talked to her the way I used to talk to her in her kitchen, rambling and real, telling her about the case and the phone call and my son's new apartment and the patient I'd seen that morning, who reminded me of her a little, the same quiet certainty in the eyes. I told her I didn't know what forgiveness was supposed to feel like from the inside. Whether it was something you decided or something that happened to you. Whether it was one moment or 10,000 small ones stretched across years. I told her I was going to figure it out. The wind moved through the trees above me, slow and easy, and somewhere behind me a bird called once and then went quiet. I don't know if that means anything, but it felt, for a moment, like an answer.